So for my first educational video, I wanted to talk a lot about trauma because trauma is one of those things that really seems to affect a lot of people who are stuck with their weight loss journey. It's a big barrier to anybody who wants to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So let's define trauma. What does that mean? The word trauma gets thrown around a lot in society, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions that come with that. Trauma can be a big T. Those are things that people usually think about when someone's traumatized, like going off to war, being deployed, having some sort of disaster happen, being part of a terrorist attack, surviving a terrible hurricane, tornado, witnessing the horrific death of someone in a car accident, things like that. Are what we traditionally think of when we talk about trauma, but there are other big T events that other people don't usually think about, like surviving an abusive relationship or being emotionally and physically abused by a parent. Those are also big T's. Sexual abuse is another that have the exact same effect as one of those other types of traumas like war or natural disasters. There are traumas with little t's as well, that over time, if there are many of them, or if your perception of the event is that of a big T, even though it might be classified as a little t, that ends up being trauma just as much as a big T trauma would be to you. It's about perception. Your perception is your truth. So if you perceive even things with little t's as traumatic, then they'll affect you the exact same way that a big T trauma would. So a lot of times people have a hard time thinking like, well, that person's life isn't that bad, and they might have difficulty understand why you might perceive something as traumatic, but it's not their job to tell you what is your truth. That's your truth, and that's your experience, and that's how you perceive things. So trauma is, regardless of whatever you perceive as the trauma, is something that affects you over the long term. All of us have a normal response to things in our life, like, the death of a loved one that was maybe passing away for quite some time because of some chronic illness or things like that. But we all react differently to different things. So someone might cope well with that event. Someone may not. There are some people who are more resilient than others. There are some people who have more what we call in therapy land protective factors. Protective factors include things like a great support system, a great set of coping skills that are healthy that you use often and access all the time. Or also it can mean that there's a lack of other trauma in your life and you've had a pretty great life up until now. So a lot of times clients I see who have endured trauma not only have had terrible things happen, like have domestic violence relationships or have been physically abused, but they also then don't have a great support system. They may not have great parenting experiences from their own parents to be role models to them on how to cope with things. So that's how sometimes, big T's linger, more so for some than others. And little t's can be perceived as big T's because your ability to cope does not meet the amount of stress that you are able to handle. That's kind of part of the definition of trauma too, is when your stress or the traumatic event exceeds your ability to cope. And so when we have somebody who has trauma, what do we see as symptoms? Usually we see people who have sleep disturbances. Nightmares are another part of it. And it kind of falls into categories. So we have the re-experiencing category with trauma. That means that you're having nightmares, dreams about the situation. You sometimes what we call dissociate, which means you kind of daydream about that thing that happened to you. So you might find yourself having these thoughts in vulnerable moments, but you might also find them coming in as uninvited guests that is triggered by some sort of memory of what happened to you, or there's the triggers will be a whole nother video, but that's part of it too, is there's some sort of triggering event, whether it's a sight or a smell or a taste or a song that you hear on the radio, or just a place that you're in that reminds you of that traumatic event or situation, that throws you into this, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm back at that moment that terrible thing was happening. We also have avoidance behavior when it comes to trauma. So you might find yourself avoiding things that you kind of maybe haven't labeled them as triggers. That's another word that gets used incorrectly in our society. Oh, I'm triggered. These are real triggers. That's the origin of the word. So when you have certain things that you know will bring you back to that place or make you think about that thing that happened that was terrible, or that situation, you avoid them. So you might be not seeing certain people, you might not be going to certain places, you might avoid types of music, or just sight, sound, smells, whatever is reminding you of that traumatic experience. And the last category in defining trauma symptoms is increased arousal. So what does that mean? That means that you're what we call hypervigilant. You're more aware than you should be of your surroundings. So you might find this in, some of those anxiety thoughts. Because of your trauma history, you feel places are dangerous because they remind you of something dangerous, but in reality, they're not dangerous. It's just because of your experience in the trauma. The other thing that we see with increased arousal is increased startle reflex. So you might be really jumpy. You might just jump way more than other people when there's a loud noise, or you might be hypersensitive to loud noises, more so after the traumatic event than you were beforehand. So that's the other category of trauma symptoms that we see in people. So from a brain perspective, what's happening with trauma? So it's the same type of thing that happens with anxiety, but it's on a grander scale with trauma. It's when our brain secretes the exact same chemicals, adrenaline being the biggest one, that we used in evolutionary times. Think back to tribal times, we were fighting lions, to help us fight off threats. So what does our body do? It secretes adrenaline, which shuts off our frontal lobe functioning pretty much. So we're not able to reason as well, we're not able to problem solve as well, and we're putting all of our mental energy into survival at that point. So we may not make great decisions when we're in this state of mind, and we might act impulsively. What else does it do? It changes our energy in our body, and it makes our heart beat faster. It speeds up our breathing as a way to prep our body to run away. So with the extra adrenaline, the extra heart rate, it turns off our pain sensors, so we can run for a longer period of time than we probably would be able to if we weren't scared of something. So we're able to, have that endurance because of that. Or if we're going to fight, we need that same exact thing. So it'll give us a little bit more blood flow to our muscles and help us in the fight. So if you're fighting a lion or running away from a lion, you need a little bit of a boost in your body to be able to do that. So that's what the adrenaline is there for. Freeze is kind of when that just doesn't work, when our body kind of doesn't know whether to fight or to run away. So we just sort of deer in headlights freeze. Our mind just shuts down in that moment. So these exact responses are exactly what you see in today's world with our perceived threats. Now, we are not fighting lions anymore, but we do still have perceived threats. So what does that look like for certain people? Regular stressors secrete the same brain chemicals that fighting lions does. It's a perceived threat to us, whether it's mental, physical, whatever. So our body does the exact same thing. Now, with trauma, you have this traumatic event. Your body secretes those chemicals appropriately in response to something that is really, a big perceived threat to you, regardless of what the trauma was. And it, reacts. Now, with trauma, what we see First, with anxiety disorders and with trauma, that fight or flight response is overactive. You end up having that same response at that same level at the time that traumatic thing happened when it's not happening. So you might have that same level of response when you smell something that makes you think of that traumatic event. You might have that same level of response when you see somebody, or you're in a place that reminds you, or the same place that the bad thing happened. That is when you get that extreme fight or flight reaction with trauma, and it happens over and over for an extended period of time. So that's where you have, there's normal responses to terrible things. Anybody who survived a terrorist attack is going to have that experience for a certain period of time. But then as time goes on, you have the people who have more protective factors, who are able to stop having those responses, or their responses to those triggers decrease over time. Whereas somebody who doesn't have those protective factors and isn't as resilient because of whatever reason, they end up having a maintained, repetitive time period where they have this elevated response to anything that triggers that memory of the traumatic event. So that's a little bit about trauma. Now, why is this important? So when we have a traumatic event that's not ever addressed in therapy, or in any other way, it just lingers. It'll stick with you, and sometimes people even get stuck at the place they were when that traumatic event happened, and they find themselves getting into patterns of not great relationships, not great performance in their career, and they see this pattern of behavior that goes on, and it's self-sabotaging. They're not moving forward with their life. And a lot of times people who are in that situation get depressed. They get just stuck in this rut of difficulty, and they have a difficult time getting out. And sometimes those people end up self-medicating to help them with whatever it is that's bothering them. And this is true of trauma and anxiety, but it's really important for you to understand that food is a really, really common drug of choice when it comes to trauma and anxiety, because when fight or flight puts you in survival mode. What do you do in survival mode? You want to bring yourself comfort. You want to bring yourself peace. You want the threat to go away. So the self-medication with food does that for people. I'm going to do another video about the science behind what food does to our brain and how it makes it addictive. But it's really important for you to understand that self-medicating with food is just like self-medicating with a drug, because it brings you comfort and it helps you also get control of something. Most people who have a trauma history or have an anxiety disorder feel as though their life is really out of control. And so they, control their eating because they can't control anything else. So you might eat too much, or you might eat the wrong foods, but because they bring you comfort, you keep doing it. Even though you know cognitively in your brain that it's unhealthy to continue to eat this way, you still do it because it's maybe the only thing that you can control, you feel you can control, or it's something that brings you some comfort when you're really feeling down. And I have to say, this is something I've discovered about myself. I didn't ever really think I was an emotional eater, to be perfectly honest. I started my weight loss journey when I was 16 years old. I'm 34 now, and I kept the weight off for years until I got pregnant with my son and gained pregnancy weight. And now I find myself having fertility issues trying to get pregnant again. And one of the things that was recommended that I do is to really eliminate my dairy consumption and really decrease my processed carbohydrate intake, because supposedly the science behind that interferes with fertility treatment and your hormones. So I'm not going to get into that, but I find myself when I'm stressed, even though I know portion control, even though I know, these things are bad for me, but in moderation, I can get away with eating them. I find myself reaching for all of these comfort foods of mine, like ice cream. It's the summer. I want to go have ice cream. When, I'm getting like salty cravings a lot of the time, which it's hard to find salty things that bring you comfort that, aren't carb laden. So I get it. I totally understand. I'm living that right now with you, because I'm not able to have those things. And there's a huge emotional component to eating. So anyway, so that's some psychoeducation on trauma and self-medicating with food. We'll talk a lot more about that in my video about the addictive qualities of food and the science behind it. A little disclaimer: if you find yourself having some of these symptoms that we talked about in this video of trauma, or you feel you've endured trauma and it's not been addressed, please seek therapy. I'm not here to be your therapist. I'm here to give you some information and help you to get on the right path and break through these barriers. But trauma is very serious and can only really be completely addressed with a therapist who has training and experience in this area. So I'd really encourage you to do that if you're finding these things to sound familiar of yourself and that you feel like you would fall into this category and you have not fully addressed that yet. But if you could please like and subscribe and hit that little bell at the top of the screen so that you can get notifications of when I post videos. And I hope to see you soon.